High above the hills of Los Angeles, Griffith Park stretches across more than 4,000 acres. And although its landscape is known for the Hollywood sign, the observatory, and the zoo, there's also something up here that's rather strange. Tucked into one of the quieter valleys is a complex of abandoned cages and artificial rocks. In other words, this is the old, abandoned LA Zoo, one of the most unusual ruins in California. Originally built in 1912 and later expanded through New Deal labor projects, these now empty cages were a part of Los Angeles' first attempt to show that it belonged to America's major class of cities, since back then, zoos were actually expressions of cultural maturity, a way for a young metropolis to prove that it had finally arrived. But as it turns out, keeping animals in captivity is much easier said than done, and Los Angeles learned that lesson quickly. The zoo was built cheaply, staffed lightly, and designed without real zoological expertise. And within days of opening, the obvious complications became brutally apparent, dooming the complex completely. So how did LA end up with an abandoned zoo in one of its most iconic public spaces? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the story of the old LA Zoo. I'm your host Ryan Sokesh, and you're watching It's History. Surprisingly, the idea of keeping animals for public viewing has been around for thousands of years. In the ancient world, exotic creatures were kept as icons of power. Pharaohs collected lions and baboons. Chinese emperors curated collections of predators to display the reach of their empire, and European kings kept hunting trophies as tokens of conquest. And although they all collected in different ways, the idea was universal, proof that the wild could be bent to human will. Now, for centuries, these collections were private, only seen by royalty and the elite, but by the 18th and early 19th centuries, something shifted. As Europe entered the age of scientific curiosity and industrial expansion, the aristocratic collections evolved into zoological gardens. For example, London's Regent's Park Zoo opened in 1828. Not long after, Paris expanded its garden into a public attraction, and the notion spread across cultures as people tried to understand the natural world and their place within it. By the mid-1800s, the concept had crossed the Atlantic. American cities embraced zoos as markers of cultural legitimacy. Since, remember, back then, they were trying to build beyond the best of European scale. And it didn't take long before New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Boston all built zoological parks, blending entertainment, education, and civic pride. But back in Southern California, the story evolved more modestly. Before LA had a proper zoo, it had Eastlake Park, known today as Lincoln Park, where the city maintained a loose collection of animals in makeshift pens. According to historical accounts, the collection included bears, deer, small carnivores, and the occasional donated exotic creature, often acquired through informal arrangements with traveling circuses or private collectors. Remember, LA is pretty far from everything else, so in the late 19th century, transporting animals wasn't easy. Many would arrive by rail after a long, stressful journey across the Southwest, if they even made it there alive at all. And for those who survived this journey, the conditions were abysmal. Still, it didn't really matter, since Los Angeles wanted that cultural stature that East Coast cities already displayed. And with the city's explosive growth at the turn of the century, that desire only intensified. Then, a solution was found. In 1896, Griffith J. Griffith donated over 3,000 acres of rugged land to the city. And although it was meant to be a park, much of it sat undeveloped for years, though many people thought this would be the perfect area for a zoo. By the early 1900s, newspapers, educators, and city officials all echoed that same sentiment. Everyone knew that LA needed an actual zoo, though two problems stood in their way: money and expertise. But as public pressure grew, the city leaders finally acted. In 1912, they approved the construction of a new zoological zone inside Griffith Park. Despite limited funding and almost no professional guidance, workers began building enclosures directly into the hillside. To save money, they used things like recycled fencing, cast-off lumber, and concrete poured in very uneven layers across a rugged terrain. The results were crude, but in the end, Los Angeles had a zoo to call its own, although they'd soon find out that it wouldn't be so easy. When the Griffith Park Zoo opened in 1912, The first challenge was filling the cages. Basically, LA had to improvise, finding animals wherever they could. Some animals were transferred from Eastlake Park, hauled across the city in wooden crates on flatbed wagons. Others arrived by rail from the Midwest or even beyond. Bears and mountain lions were sometimes captured locally and sold to the city for small sums. Or the traveling circuses, passing through LA, would still sell some of their older but exotic animals. And even with the bear offerings, the public still truly loved their new zoo. And it's important to note that visitors weren't thinking about animal welfare. They were thinking about novelty, about the thrill of seeing something like a monkey, but in real life. Meaning, for a time, the old Griffith Park Zoo was a top-tier attraction, but behind the scenes, the reality was pretty ugly. The enclosures were never designed to handle increasing crowds or a growing collection. Drainage was poor, and summer trapped heat inside the grotto-like pits to a dangerous effect. But perhaps the worst fact was that veterinary support was minimal, and keepers often relied on guesswork to care for their animals. According to various accounts, illnesses went untreated, diets were improvised, and sanitation fell behind even the worst standards of the time. Hence, by the 1930s, the issue had become too serious to ignore. The public still visited, but their reactions were shifting from excitement to concern. This facility needed to modernize, but the budget and the know-how still prevented any real progress. But then there was a turning point: the Works Progress Administration. As part of the New Deal, unemployed laborers were sent to improve infrastructure across the country. In Griffith Park, they renovated the old zoo to give that hillside a more naturalistic appearance. The bear grotto became a major attraction. The monkey cages looked orderly and geometric, and newspaper ads described the facility as humane or even scientific. But sadly, the makeover was rather thin. It seemed that no one could change the zoo's fundamental flaw. The footprint was just too cramped, and everything there was too outdated. Didn't matter how much they renovated. The staff-to-animal ratio never came close to what a modern zoo required. Add that to the fact that by the 1950s, zoos across the country were embracing natural habitats, larger enclosures, and dedicated veterinary programs. Los Angeles, by comparison, was stuck back in the 1930s. Photographs circulated of lions pacing grooves into concrete floors. Bears displayed clear signs of stress. Primates clung to the same iron bars that had defined the zoo's earliest days. At this point, the public had had enough. Attendance dipped, funding stagnated, and critics grew louder. City officials needed to save face, and so they decided to relocate. In doing so, they left the zoo behind forever. Once the city approved the relocation, everything moved quickly. Planning teams surveyed a flatter section of Griffith Park, architects drafted blueprints, and for the first time in history, LA committed to designing a facility with actual zoological principles in mind. From there, concrete foundations were poured for larger paddocks as a veterinarian building rose at the center of the site. And then slowly, the animals were moved into their new cages. The transfer went on for weeks, always beginning before dawn, on weekdays when the park was nearly empty. Lions were sedated and placed in steel-lined crates, whereas the bears were guided into transport cages using food rewards and patience. As for the primates, well, they were moved in small groups to reduce stress. Most shipments traveled by truck along park service roads, completing the journey quickly. In fact, the public had hardly noticed that anything was happening. But still, just like that, the old Griffith Park Zoo was emptied. Keepers finished their final rounds, locked the gates, and walked away. The new Los Angeles Zoo opened in 1966, hailed as a fresh start and proved that the city had finally caught up with modern standards. In the meantime, the former site sat untouched, and it didn't take long before most of the public had forgotten about it completely. Though by the 1970s, the ruins had become an unofficial destination for urban explorers. The city noticed the foot traffic, but didn't intervene. And of course, this ultimately led to complications. Graffiti spread across the rock walls, broken glass bottles and beer cans filled the abandoned animal pits, and occasionally, fires were lit in the tunnels. And things just evolved in this way. By the 1980s and 90s, with the old zoo now in a state of ultimate disrepair, artists and photographers chose to embrace the strange mix of nature and decay. Indeed, its reputation grew in the art world, to the point that film crews began showing up, and the location became a sort of mainstream attraction. And then, by the 2000s, the old zoo had entered a new phase as a makeshift picnic area, as it now officially remains to this very day. And so, LA embraced one of its most interesting urban ruins. The enclosures remain open to the public, empty, graffiti-covered, and strangely inviting, which makes this the first story of its type on the channel, since typically, an abandoned turn-of-the-century object would have been demolished or completely fenced off. I think we'll leave it there for today, but I thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.